At exactly 6:12 p.m. on a Tuesday, my father took a black Sharpie, drew one slow line through my name on a legal document worth $2.4 million, and said calmly, "Problem solved." He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even look at me. That was the moment I realized something chilling. He had planned to erase me long before he ever picked up that marker. And what I didn't know then, what would take me months to uncover, was that the document he crossed my name off of wasn't even the real one. Before I tell you how I learned that, and how everything in my family unraveled after that night, let me say this. If you've ever had someone who was supposed to protect you turn into the person who tried to control you, hit subscribe right now. Because this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when the quietest person in the room decides they're done being silent. And trust me, the silence in my family had been building for years. My name is Dr. Natalie Brooks. I'm 32 years old. I'm a registered nurse practitioner. And for most of my life, I believed in one simple rule. If you worked hard enough, family would eventually respect you. I was wrong. I learned that the night my father decided I was no longer his daughter, at least not in the way that mattered. The Brooks family owned a successful private rehabilitation center outside Cedar Falls, Iowa. It wasn't flashy, no marble floors or fancy branding, but it was profitable, very profitable. Brooks Recovery and Wellness brought in about $3.1 million annually. According to the financial reports, I'd helped prepare myself for nearly a decade. I'd worked there since I was 19, not because I had to, because I believed it was my future. I studied nursing while working night shifts. I helped modernize patient systems. I introduced telehealth programs during COVID that increased revenue by 27%. I did everything a future partner would do because my father, Daniel Howard Brooks, had always said the same thing. One day, this will all be yours. He said it when I graduated high school. He said it when I passed my boards. He said it when I turned down a hospital job in Des Moines to stay and help him expand the clinic. And I believed him. For years, my younger brother, Ethan Daniel Brooks, never believed in anything except himself. He was 2 years younger than me. He dropped out of college twice, had 3 failed business ventures, and once used clinic funds to buy a sports car he couldn't afford, which my father quietly covered. But Ethan had something I didn't. He was the son, the heir, the one who carried the name. That phrase came up a lot in our house. Too much, actually. Still, I told myself it didn't matter, because actions mattered more than words. And for years, the actions pointed to me. Until the night, everything changed. The meeting was supposed to be routine, a family financial planning session. My father said we needed to update ownership structures for tax efficiency. He invited his attorney, Lawrence Cole Whitman, estate lawyer, age 67, precise, emotionless, the kind of man who treated family dynamics like spreadsheet formulas. We sat around the conference table at the clinic, my father at the head, Ethan beside him, leaning back like he owned the building already, me across from them, and Mr. Whitman with a leather folder. That was when I noticed something strange. There were only 2 copies of the ownership transfer agreement, not 3. I should have asked about it. I didn't. Not yet. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat. Effective next quarter, he said, Brooks Recovery and Wellness will be reorganized as a limited partnership. He slid the documents across the table. Ownership will be distributed accordingly. I picked mine up, and that was when I felt something cold spread through my chest. My name was listed, but only for 10% ownership. Ethan had 70%. My father retained 20%. I thought it had to be a mistake. I'd been told for years the split would be equal. I looked up. "Dad," I said carefully, "this isn't what we discussed." He didn't answer immediately. He just uncapped the Sharpie, slowly, deliberately, and then in front of the attorney, in front of Ethan, in front of me, he crossed out my name entirely, one thick black line. "Actually," he said calmly, "this makes more sense. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The air felt thick, like a storm, waiting to break. Ethan smirked. Mr. Whitman adjusted his glasses, but said nothing, and my father finally looked at me. His eyes were completely steady. "No daughter of mine needs ownership to feel secure," he said. "You have a career. You'll be fine." That sentence changed everything. Not just because of what it meant, but because of what it revealed. It told me something I'd never allowed myself to believe. This wasn't a last-minute decision. This was a long-term plan, and I had just watched the final step. He pushed the document toward me. "You can still work here," he said. "Same salary, same title." Then he added the part that still echoes in my head. "But leadership belongs to bloodlines that carry forward." If you were sitting in that chair, what would you have done? Would you have fought right there in that room, or stayed quiet long enough to understand what was really happening? Because I did something neither Ethan nor my father expected. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just said one sentence, "Okay." And that single word was the moment my revenge began. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 months earlier, I had discovered a financial record they never expected me to see. A record that proved one devastating truth. The clinic wasn't built by my father, and legally, it never belonged to him at all. But I wouldn't understand the full power of that discovery until much later. Because first, I had to survive what came next. And what happened the following week was the beginning of the worst betrayal of all. The next morning at 7:03 a.m., I unlocked the front doors of Brooks Recovery and Wellness, the same way I had for almost 10 years. Left key first, turned twice, pushed shoulder against the glass because the frame stuck in winter. Routine has a strange power. It makes you feel like nothing has changed, even when everything has. Inside the lobby smelled like disinfectant wipes and the citrus oil we used on the hardwood floors. The same soft instrumental music played through the speakers. The same patient schedule printed at the front desk. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before, except for one thing. Now I knew it wasn't mine, and never had been. At least, not in the way I thought. I worked my entire shift without saying a word about what happened in that conference room. Not to the nurses, not to administration, not even to Monica Ruiz, our billing director, who had been my closest ally at the clinic for years. Because I wasn't ready to react. I was ready to observe. There's something you learn working in healthcare, especially in long-term recovery. People tell you the truth when they think you're powerless. And that morning, for the first time in my life, my father believed exactly that. At 10:14 a.m., I overheard him laughing in his office with Ethan. The door wasn't fully closed. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard every word anyway. "She took it better than I expected," Ethan said. My father chuckled. "She always does. Natalie's predictable." There was a pause. Then Ethan asked the question that made my stomach tighten. "You think she suspects?" My father didn't hesitate. "No," he said. "She's too loyal to ever question the foundation." The foundation. That word stuck in my head all day. Because 3 months earlier, I had questioned it. And what I found was the first crack in everything my father claimed. It started with something small, a routine audit. I'd been reviewing old financial statements to prepare for a new insurance compliance check. Boring work, the kind you do on autopilot, until I noticed something strange. The clinic's original purchase documents weren't in our internal records. That wasn't normal. Any business keeps founding ownership documentation easily accessible. But ours stopped at year 2. Everything before that had been archived externally, which was odd and suspicious. I asked Monica if she knew where the earliest records were stored. She shrugged. "Probably county filings," she said. "Pre-digital stuff." I almost left it there. Almost. But something about that gap bothered me. So I made a decision that changed my life. I went to the Black Hawk County Recorder's office on my day off. I told myself it was just curiosity, a professional interest, nothing more. I didn't know then that I was walking into the first layer of a secret my family had buried for decades. The records clerk pulled the original property file within minutes. A thick folder, faded documents, stamped pages from 1998. I flipped through, casually at first. Deed transfer, zoning approval, medical facility licensing. Then I saw it. The name listed under original ownership. Not Daniel Brooks, not Brooks Family Holdings, not anything connected to my father at all. The clinic had been purchased under a completely different name. Margaret Evelyn Brooks, my grandmother. For a moment, I thought it was just a clerical step. Maybe she helped with financing. Maybe it was temporary. But then I saw the next page. Full ownership declaration. Sole proprietor. No co-signers. No shared interest. And the date was 2 years before my father even started working there. I remember sitting in that cold county office chair, staring at the page while a slow realization spread through me. The story I'd heard my entire life wasn't true. Growing up, my father told everyone the same version. He said he built the clinic from nothing. He said he took financial risks no one else would. He said he carried the family on his back. It was part of his identity, his authority, his justification for controlling everything. But the paperwork told a different story, one that raised a question I couldn't ignore. If my grandmother was the original owner, what happened to her share, and why had I never heard about it? I copied the documents that day, quietly, legally. Nothing illegal. Public records are accessible to anyone. But I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not yet, because I needed more answers. And deep down, I was afraid of what those answers might reveal. Back in the present, sitting at my desk that afternoon, I pulled out the copies again. The edges had started to curl. I read the ownership line over and over. Margaret Evelyn Brooks, sole proprietor, which meant one thing, a simple, unavoidable legal truth. Ownership doesn't disappear. It transfers. It's inherited. Or it's sold. And I had never seen a single document proving either. That meant only one possibility remained. There had to be a will, and I had never seen it. At 4:47 p.m., my father walked past my office. He stopped at the doorway. "You're quiet today," he said. His tone was light, almost casual, but his eyes were studying me, measuring. I met his gaze calmly. "I'm working," I said. He nodded. "Good," he replied, "because we have a leadership transition coming." Then, he added almost as an afterthought, "You should start thinking about your future outside the business." That was the moment something inside me shifted completely. Not anger, not hurt, something colder, clarity, because his words confirmed what the Sharpie line already had. He wasn't just cutting me out of ownership. He was preparing to erase me from the clinic entirely. And he believed I had no power to stop him. He was wrong, but I couldn't confront him yet. Not until I understood the full truth. Because in legal battles, just like in medicine, timing determines survival. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at my grandmother's name on those documents. I hadn't thought about her in years. Margaret Brooks died when I was 11. I remembered her as quiet, watchful, always sitting at the end of the table during family gatherings. She rarely argued with my father, but she also never seemed afraid of him. There was something steady about her, something self-contained. And now I realized something else. She had built the foundation he claimed as his own, which meant one question mattered more than anything else. Where did her ownership go after she died? I didn't know yet, but I was about to find out. Because 2 days later, a small detail in an old probate record would reveal something my father never expected anyone to discover. Something that would change everything about that Sharpie line he drew through my name. And once I saw it, I understood why he had been so confident I would never question the foundation. Because the truth wasn't just hidden, it had been deliberately buried. 3 days after my name was erased, I found the document that proved my father had been lying for over 20 years. And the most terrifying part wasn't the lie itself. It was how carefully he had hidden it. It happened at 1:26 p.m. on a Friday during my lunch break. I drove to the Black Hawk County Courthouse under the excuse of picking up updated licensing forms for the clinic. Technically, that wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the real reason I was there. I was there because of one question that wouldn't stop echoing in my mind. If my grandmother owned the clinic outright, where did her ownership go when she died? In the probate records office, the air smelled like old paper and dust. The clerk behind the counter didn't even look up when I gave my grandmother's full name. Year of death, she asked. 2003, I replied. She typed for a few seconds. Then she stood, walked into the archive room, and returned with a gray folder. Estate file, she said, sliding it across the counter. Public record. My hands felt steady as I opened it, but inside, something deep in my chest was already bracing. Because I had a feeling, a quiet, instinctive one, that whatever I found in that folder would explain everything. The first pages were exactly what I expected. Inventory of assets, property listings, tax statements. The clinic was listed clearly. Commercial medical property, Brooks, Recovery, and Wellness. Appraised value, at the time, $612,000. Owned solely by Margaret Evelyn Brooks. So far, nothing surprising. Then I turned the page, and everything changed. There, in clean legal formatting, was the line that froze me. Primary beneficiary, Natalie Marie Brooks. My name. Not my father's, not Ethan's, mine. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was misreading it. I blinked. Read it again. The words didn't change. My grandmother had left the clinic to me, not to her son, not to the family, not even shared. To me, solely. My pulse started pounding in my ears. I flipped through the rest of the will quickly. There was no ambiguity, no legal loophole, no shared trusteeship. It stated clearly the clinic ownership would be held in trust until I reached the age of 30, at which point full legal control would transfer to me. I sat there staring at the page, feeling like the ground beneath my entire life was shifting. Because if this was true, then everything my father had told me was a lie. Every time he said he built the clinic, every time he said ownership was his to decide, every time he used the phrase, my business, my rules, it wasn't just manipulation, it was fraud. But then I saw something else, a detail that made the situation far more complicated. At the bottom of the will was a legal clause, one that explained exactly how my father had kept control for so long. It read, until beneficiary reaches age 30, trustee authority shall remain with Daniel Howard Brooks. Trustee, not owner. Trustees manage assets. They do not own them. They cannot legally transfer ownership, and they cannot erase beneficiaries. My hands began to tremble slightly as I understood the full implications. The Sharpie line my father drew through my name 3 days ago had no legal power. None, because he wasn't erasing an employee. He was attempting to erase the rightful owner. But the most disturbing part wasn't what the document said. It was what it didn't say. There was no record that I had ever been informed. No notification letter. No court acknowledgement of delivery. Nothing, which meant only one thing. Someone had intentionally kept this information from me for almost 2 decades. I already knew who, but I needed proof. Because suspicion isn't evidence. And in a situation like this, evidence was everything. I leaned toward the clerk. Was this will contested? I asked quietly. She checked the file. Probate closed normally, she said. No disputes. That answer hit me like a cold wave. Because it meant my father had never challenged the will. He hadn't tried to fight it in court. He hadn't attempted to change it legally. Instead, he had simply hidden it and waited. Waiting made sense now. Because as trustee, he controlled the clinic's operations until I turned 30. And I had turned 30 2 years ago. 2 full years. Which meant something else became clear in that moment. Legally, he should have transferred control already. He hadn't, which meant he wasn't just lying anymore. He was actively violating the terms of a trust. And in legal terms, That's called a breach of fiduciary duty, a serious one, the kind that can destroy a career and lead to personal liability. I closed the folder slowly because now I understood something critical. My father hadn't crossed out my name because he believed he had power. He crossed it out because he was running out of time. He knew I was getting close to discovering the truth, and he needed to assert control before I did. As I left the courthouse, my mind was completely clear. The pain I felt earlier in the week had been replaced by something colder, something sharper, knowledge. Because once you understand the law, manipulation loses its power. But there was still one question that haunted me. If the will existed in public records, how had my father managed to keep me unaware for so long? Because probate courts typically notify beneficiaries. It's standard procedure, which meant one thing didn't add up. Somewhere between the court and me, something had been intercepted or deliberately misdirected, and I didn't know how. Not yet. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a photocopy of the will. The words looked calm, ordinary, but they carried a truth powerful enough to dismantle everything my father had built his authority on. And I realized something important. Revenge didn't mean confronting him immediately. It meant waiting, watching, and choosing the exact moment when the truth would have the maximum impact. Because when that moment came, it wouldn't just expose him, it would dismantle the foundation of control he had relied on for decades. I thought about confronting him right then, marching into his office, dropping the document on his desk, demanding answers. But I didn't, because I needed to know one more thing first, something even more important than ownership. I needed to know whether he had only hidden the will, or if he had done something worse. And the answer to that question came 5 days later, when I discovered a financial transfer record dated exactly 2 weeks after my 30th birthday. A transfer that should never have existed, one that would prove my father wasn't just hiding the truth. He had been actively trying to steal it. The document that proved my father tried to steal the clinic wasn't hidden in a safe. It wasn't locked in a vault. It wasn't even buried under complex legal language. It was sitting quietly in a routine financial report, the kind no one ever reads closely unless they're looking for something specific. And I was, because once you know where the foundation cracks, you start noticing every shift in the structure above it. I found the record at 8:52 p.m. on a Monday night, alone, in the clinic's administrative office. The building was almost silent, only the faint hum of HVAC and the distant beep of a patient monitor in the overnight wing. I had stayed late under the excuse of reconciling quarterly operating costs. No one questioned it, because for years, that had been normal. I was the one who stayed, the one who fixed problems, the one who carried responsibility quietly. My father had depended on that. He just never imagined that same diligence would one day turn against him. The report in front of me was routine. Internal ownership adjustment, yearly audit summary. Normally I skimmed these. Nothing interesting ever happened in them. But this time, I wasn't skimming. I was searching, looking for one date in particular. My 30th birthday, March 17th, 2 years ago. The day the trust should have legally transferred to me. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Revenue figures, insurance reimbursements, equipment depreciation. Then, near the bottom of page 12, I saw a line that made my stomach tighten. Equity restructuring. Transfer March 29th, 12 days after my birthday. The timing alone was suspicious. But what came next was worse. The report stated, trustee authorized internal reallocation of ownership interest into holding entity. Holding entity. That phrase hit me like a warning bell, because holding companies are often used to shield assets, and sometimes to obscure ownership. I opened the attached documentation. My pulse slowed. My breathing became steady, because in that moment, instinct told me something critical. This wasn't just financial management. This was concealment. The paperwork showed that 2 weeks after I turned 30, my father had transferred operational control of the clinic into a newly created LLC, Brooks Healthcare Management Group, LLC, registered under his name, with Ethan listed as co-managing partner. No mention of me anywhere. Not as owner, not as beneficiary, not even as a minority interest holder. I read the document 3 times, then a 4th, because I needed to be absolutely certain I wasn't misunderstanding what I was seeing. But the language was clear, painfully clear. This wasn't a routine administrative action. It was a strategic move, a legal maneuver designed to shift control before I could claim it. The deeper I read, the more disturbing the details became. The transfer didn't involve selling the clinic. It involved reassigning operational authority, which meant my father, technically, hadn't violated ownership terms. But he had done something equally damaging. He had stripped the trust of its practical power. Because while the trust still held title, the new LLC controlled day-to-day operations, revenue flow, hiring authority, financial decision-making, everything that actually mattered. In simple terms, he couldn't take the building from me, so he took everything inside it. I leaned back in the office chair, staring at the ceiling. Not shocked, not angry, just very, very clear. Because now I understood the full scope of his plan. He hadn't just erased me emotionally. He had tried to erase me legally, piece by piece, quietly, strategically. And the timing told me something else, something even more unsettling. He didn't make this move recently. He made it the moment he realized the trust would expire, which meant he had anticipated the risk, planned for it, prepared long before I ever suspected anything. For years, I believed my father's control came from personality, from dominance, from tradition. But now I saw the truth. His real power had always been information. What he told, what he withheld, what he manipulated, and most importantly, what he believed no one would ever question. I closed the file and sat in silence for several minutes because the realization carried an unexpected weight. Not rage, not grief, something heavier, understanding. Because this wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a long, deliberate strategy, one that had likely been unfolding for decades. At 9:17 p.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. I quickly minimized the files on the screen. My father appeared in the doorway. He looked mildly surprised to see me. "Still working?" he asked. I nodded calmly. "Quarterly review," I said. He studied me for a moment, then smiled. It was the same smile he'd worn in the conference room. Confident, certain, completely unaware that I now knew everything. "Good," he said. "We'll need that diligence moving forward." That word, moving forward, echoed in my mind long after he left. Because for the first time, I realized something critical. He believed the transition was already complete. He believed he had secured his control permanently. And he believed I was still powerless. He was wrong, but I couldn't act yet. Not without understanding the final piece of the puzzle. Because there was still one question I hadn't answered. One detail that didn't fit. How had he been able to create the new LLC without notifying me? Because as the legal beneficiary of the trust, I should have received formal documentation. State law requires it. There should have been certified mail records, legal notifications, something. But I had received nothing, which meant only one possibility remained. The notices had been sent somewhere else, somewhere I didn't know about. And 3 days later, while reviewing archived administrative correspondence, I found a forwarding address form signed in my name. A form I had never seen before, never approved, never authorized. One that redirected all trust-related legal notices to a post office box I didn't recognize. A P.O. box registered under a name that made my hands go completely still when I read it. Because it belonged to someone I trusted, someone I never imagined could be part of the betrayal. The P.O. box number was printed in small black text at the bottom of the forwarding form. Box 4172, Cedar Falls, Maine Post Office. At first, it didn't mean anything. Just numbers. Ordinary, harmless. But the name listed as the authorized recipient made my hands go completely still on the keyboard. Because it wasn't my father. It wasn't Ethan. It wasn't a lawyer. It was someone I had trusted for years. Someone who had sat beside me at family dinners. Someone who had hugged me after my grandmother's funeral. Someone I never imagined would be part of any betrayal. The name was Monica Elena Ruiz, our clinic's billing director, my closest colleague, the person who had taught me how to read insurance contracts when I was 22. The one who stayed late with me during COVID surges. The one who always told me, "You're the future of this place, Natalie." For several seconds, I genuinely thought it had to be a mistake. A clerical error. Wrong Monica. Wrong address. Something explainable. Because the alternative felt almost impossible to accept. I opened the scanned forwarding form again. The signature line read, Natalie M. Brooks, and the signature beneath it looked convincing. At first glance, but the more I studied it, the clearer the truth became. It wasn't mine. It was a careful imitation, close enough to pass casual inspection, but not identical, because real signatures carry muscle memory, tiny habits, pressure patterns. This one lacked them. It was a forgery. I leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling. Not shocked, not angry, just very, very aware. Because now, the situation was no longer just a family betrayal. It was something larger, something calculated. Someone had forged my signature to redirect legal notices, which meant multiple steps had been involved. Obtaining my signature samples, filing official postal documentation, coordinating with the trust's legal correspondence, and maintaining the deception for years. That wasn't a spontaneous act. That was a sustained operation, and Monica Ruiz's name was attached to it, which meant one of two things was true. Either she was directly involved, or she had been used without understanding the full implications. I needed to know which, because the answer would determine everything that came next. I didn't confront her immediately, because confrontation without evidence only leads to denial, and denial protects the guilty. So instead, I did what I always did best. I observed, quietly, carefully, without changing my behavior. Over the next 2 days, I watched Monica closely. She behaved exactly as she always had. Warm, professional, supportive. She asked about my workload, checked in about insurance audits, even brought me coffee on Wednesday morning, like she had hundreds of times before. If she was involved in deception, she hid it perfectly, which made the situation even more unsettling, because it meant one thing. Either she was extremely skilled at lying, or she didn't know she had been used. At 5:41 p.m. on Thursday, an opportunity finally came. We were alone in the billing office. No staff nearby, no distractions, just the hum of computers and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. I placed the printed forwarding form on the desk between us, without explanation, without accusation, and said calmly, "Do you recognize this?" She looked down. Her expression shifted immediately. Not to defensiveness, not to anger, to something much simpler, confusion. She picked up the paper, read it slowly, then looked back at me. Her voice was quiet. I've never seen this before. I held her gaze, not aggressively, not suspiciously, just steadily. Your name is listed as the P.O. Box recipient, I said. She frowned. That's impossible. The sincerity in her reaction was unmistakable. Not theatrical, not calculated. It was genuine, which meant something critical. She hadn't knowingly participated. She had been used. She read the document again, more carefully this time. Then her eyes widened slightly. "Oh my God," she whispered. "This address." She looked up at me. "That's the clinic's old insurance overflow box." The words settled into place instantly. Because now, everything made sense. Years ago, before digital billing systems, the clinic had maintained a P.O. box for excess insurance correspondence. Monica had managed it. It was part of her job, routine, unremarkable, completely legitimate, which made it the perfect cover. "Your father asked me to keep that box open," she said slowly. "He told me it was for delayed reimbursement notices." Her voice tightened. I never questioned it. And there it was, the missing link, My father hadn't recruited Monica into deception. He had used her role, her trust, her routine responsibilities. He redirected my legal notices to a box she managed, knowing she would process them automatically, without reading their contents closely, without suspecting anything, because she believed she was doing standard administrative work. I felt no anger toward her, only clarity, because this confirmed something essential. My father's greatest weapon had never been intimidation. It had always been quiet manipulation, using ordinary systems, ordinary people, ordinary routines, to hide extraordinary deception. Monica looked at me, her face pale. "Natalie, what is this about?" I met her eyes calmly. "Ownership," I said. "And the truth," she swallowed. "I had no idea," she whispered. "I would never." "I know," I said gently. And I meant it, because I could see the truth in her expression. She wasn't part of the betrayal. She had been an instrument of it, just like I had been for years. We sat in silence for several seconds. Then she said something that shifted everything again. "There's something else you need to know." She walked to her filing cabinet, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a thin manila folder. "This came through the P.O. box 2 years ago," she said quietly. "I didn't think it was important at the time." She handed it to me. Inside was a legal notice, dated exactly 1 week after my 30th birthday. A formal letter from the trust administrator, addressed to me, stating clearly, "Beneficiary Natalie Marie Brooks is entitled to full transfer of operational authority effective immediately." I closed my eyes briefly, because this confirmed the final truth. My father hadn't just hidden the will. He hadn't just manipulated ownership structures. He had deliberately intercepted legal transfer notices to prevent me from claiming my rights for 2 full years. But the most important detail wasn't the letter itself. It was the signature at the bottom. Not mine, not my father's, but the name of the attorney who had sent it. The same one who had been present in the conference room when my father crossed out my name. Lawrence Cole Whitman, which meant something chilling. The lawyer, who appeared to represent neutral legal process, had known the truth all along and had allowed the deception to continue. That realization changed everything. Because now, this wasn't just a family conflict. It wasn't just a hidden inheritance. It was a coordinated legal concealment, one involving professionals, documentation, and years of deliberate silence. I looked at Monica slowly, and for the first time since this began, I felt something different from clarity. I felt the quiet beginning of something sharper. Not anger, not rage, something colder. Resolve, because I finally understood the scale of what had been done. And I understood something else too. The moment I chose to act, it wouldn't just expose my father. It would bring down everyone who had helped him hide the truth. But I wasn't ready to move yet, because there was still one final layer I needed to uncover. One question that remained unanswered. Why had my grandmother trusted my father as trustee if she intended the clinic to belong to me? And the answer to that question came 2 days later, when I found a sealed letter in the probate file marked, "To be opened only if trustee fails beneficiary." The envelope was smaller than I expected. Plain white, no official markings, just a handwritten label in neat, steady script. "To be opened only if trustee fails beneficiary." And beneath it, in slightly faded ink, Margaret Evelyn Brooks, my grandmother's handwriting. I found it at 2:18 p.m. on a Saturday, inside a secondary archive sleeve attached to the probate file. It had been overlooked during my first visit because it wasn't part of the main will documentation. It was classified as a supplemental personal directive, not legally binding, not enforceable, just a letter, which was probably why no one had ever paid attention to it. But when I saw it, something inside me went completely still. Because my grandmother had been many things. Quiet, reserved, watchful, but she had never been careless. If she left something like this, she had a reason. I sat at a small wooden desk in the courthouse records room and held the envelope for a long time before opening it. My hands were steady, but my breathing wasn't, because deep down, I already knew what it meant. This wasn't just a message. It was an explanation, maybe even a warning. The letter inside was handwritten on lined notebook paper. 3 pages. The ink had faded slightly over time, but every word was still clear. I began reading. Natalie, if you are reading this, it means Daniel has failed you. I stopped for a moment because the certainty in that first sentence felt almost eerie. She hadn't written if. She had written it like an inevitability, like she already knew the outcome. I kept reading. I hope I'm wrong. I hope he honors his responsibilities. But I have lived long enough to know the difference between grief and character. Your father is not a cruel man, but he is a controlling one. And control when threatened makes people justify things they should never justify. My throat tightened slightly because those words captured my father perfectly. Not a monster, not a villain, but someone who believed authority gave him the right to decide everything for everyone. I made him trustee because he understands the business. But I did not give him ownership because he confuses leadership with possession. I have watched this pattern for years. First with your mother, then with you. I closed my eyes briefly because hearing my grandmother acknowledge that pattern felt like someone finally putting words to something I had felt my entire life. I continued reading. You may wonder why I did not tell you directly. The truth is simple. When you were a child, knowledge would not have protected you. It would only have made you a target sooner. That line hit me hard because it made painful sense. If I had known I was the beneficiary growing up, my father would have seen me differently, not as a daughter, but as a threat. So I chose to wait. I chose to trust that when you were older, when you had your own strength, your own career, your own independence, you would be able to face the truth safely. My grandmother hadn't been passive. She had been strategic. She hadn't stayed silent because she was weak. She had stayed silent because she was protecting me. If Daniel has honored the trust, then you may never need to read this. But if he has failed you, you must remember something important. I leaned closer to the page because the tone of the letter shifted there. It became firmer, sharper. You do not need to fight with anger. You do not need to seek revenge. You only need to insist on the truth. I read that sentence 3 times because it changed something inside me. Until that moment, part of me had framed everything as betrayal, as something emotional, personal. But my grandmother was reminding me of something deeper. This wasn't about hurting him back. It was about restoring reality. Then came the line that stayed with me the longest, the one that would echo in my mind for months afterward. He believes power comes from control, but real power comes from patience. I exhaled slowly because in that moment, I understood something clearly. My grandmother had anticipated everything. The manipulation, the concealment, the eventual conflict, and she had left me a blueprint for how to respond. Not with confrontation, not with emotional reactions, but with timing, evidence, and calm. The last part of the letter was shorter, but just as important. If you reach this point, it means you are strong enough to stand on your own. Remember this, you are not taking anything away from him. You are only reclaiming what was always yours. At the very bottom, she added one final sentence. And when the time comes, choose dignity over victory. I folded the letter carefully and sat there in silence for a long time because it didn't just explain my grandmother's choices. It clarified mine. Until that moment, I had been reacting, processing, piecing together the truth. But now, for the first time, I felt something different. Direction. Because I finally understood what needed to happen next. I wasn't going to confront my father privately. I wasn't going to negotiate behind closed doors. And I wasn't going to allow the truth to remain hidden in documents and legal files. Because secrecy had been his greatest advantage, which meant transparency had to become mine. But the timing mattered. Because if I acted too soon, he could still maneuver, still deny, still manipulate. I needed to choose a moment when the truth would be undeniable, public, impossible to rewrite, And that opportunity appeared 2 weeks later, when my father announced something that made my entire body go still when I heard it. At the next staff meeting, he stood in front of the entire clinic and said, "Next month, we'll be hosting a formal leadership transition ceremony." He smiled confidently. "After years of dedication, I'm proud to announce that Ethan Brooks will officially take over as managing partner of Brooks Recovery and Wellness." The room erupted in polite applause. But I heard nothing, because in that moment, I understood exactly what my father was planning. He wasn't just transferring control quietly. He was preparing a public event, a celebration, a formal declaration that would cement his narrative permanently. And once that happened, reversing the perception would become far more difficult. He had chosen his stage. Without realizing, he had just chosen mine too, because a public ceremony meant something powerful. It meant witnesses, documentation, accountability, and a single moment when truth could no longer be hidden behind private explanations. As the applause faded, my father looked at me across the room, confident, certain, believing I was still powerless, still unaware, still predictable. I held his gaze calmly, and for the first time since this began, I felt completely steady, because now I knew exactly what I needed to do. I just needed to wait. But there was still one final step before that moment could come. One piece of evidence I didn't have yet. Proof that my father's actions weren't just unethical, but legally actionable. And that proof arrived 5 days later, when a forensic accounting report revealed something buried deep in the clinic's financial history. Something far worse than concealed ownership. Something that crossed a line my father could never explain away. For the next 12 days, I said nothing. Not to my father, not to Ethan, not to anyone at the clinic. On the surface, everything continued exactly as before. I showed up at 7:00 a.m., reviewed patient charts, signed off on treatment plans, attended administrative meetings. I smiled when appropriate. I nodded when expected. I behaved like the same dependable, predictable daughter my father believed he understood completely, and that silence became my greatest advantage. Because when people believe you're not a threat, they stop hiding things. The announcement of the leadership transition ceremony spread quickly through the clinic. Posters appeared in the lobby, celebrating the future of Brooks Recovery and Wellness. Date, October 14th. Location, the large community conference center downtown. There would be staff donors, local officials, healthcare partners, even a press release. It wasn't just an internal event. It was a public declaration. Exactly the kind my grandmother had warned me about, the kind designed to make a narrative permanent. My father moved through the clinic with visible confidence, his posture straighter, his tone more authoritative than usual. He spoke about legacy, family leadership, and continuity. Ethan followed him like a shadow, absorbing the attention, practicing the role he believed was already his. Neither of them suspected anything, because they had mistaken my silence for defeat. But inside that silence, I was preparing, methodically, carefully, step by step, because my grandmother's letter had been clear. Insist on the truth, not with emotion, with evidence. The first step was understanding the clinic's financial history completely, not just recent records, everything, which meant bringing in someone independent, someone who couldn't be influenced by family dynamics, someone whose conclusions would carry legal weight. That's how I met Daniel Victor Hale, CPA. He specialized in forensic accounting for healthcare organizations. Calm, meticulous, the kind of professional who spoke slowly and double-checked every statement before making it. I contacted him privately, not through clinic channels, using my personal email, and I gave him one simple instruction: review everything for irregularities. He didn't ask why. Professionals like him never do it first. They let the numbers tell the story. Because numbers, unlike people, don't lie. They just wait to be interpreted. For several days, he worked quietly, analyzing tax filings, operational expenses, ownership transfer documentation, trust accounting reports, and the internal financial flows related to the new LLC. During that time, I continued my routine at the clinic, watching, listening, not reacting, because I knew something important. Truth is most powerful when it arrives unexpectedly. On the 5th day of his review, Daniel Hale called me. His voice was calm, but there was a gravity beneath it. "I need to meet in person," he said. We met at a small cafe across town at 6:34 p.m. He placed a thin folder on the table between us. Then he said something that made the world feel very quiet around me. "There are significant fiduciary irregularities." He opened the folder. Inside were charts, transaction summaries, detailed timelines, and one page highlighted in yellow. "2 years ago," he explained, "shortly after your 30th birthday, several large transfers occurred. Not small adjustments, not routine expenses, large, strategic, coordinated. Over a 6-month period, nearly $1.8 million in clinic revenue had been redirected into the new LLC. Not through illegal withdrawals, but through administrative service fees, management charges, consulting allocations, all technically legitimate on paper, but excessive, far beyond industry norms. In simple terms, the clinic's profits had been systematically drained into an entity controlled solely by my father and Ethan. Before I ever knew I had legal authority to intervene, I listened without interrupting, because clarity mattered more than reaction. Daniel continued. "This isn't criminal fraud," he said carefully, "but it is a textbook example of breach of fiduciary duty." That phrase carried enormous weight, because as trustee, my father had a legal obligation to act in the beneficiary's best interests. Instead, he had used his position to reduce the trust's financial value while enriching himself. Daniel slid another page toward me. "This is the most important part," he said. It was a timeline. On one side, the trust transfer eligibility date. On the other, the beginning of the revenue redirection. The overlap was unmistakable. The pattern was clear, and the intent was impossible to ignore. My father hadn't just prepared for a leadership transition. He had been systematically weakening the asset I was supposed to inherit. Quietly, methodically, over time. For several seconds, I said nothing. Not because I was shocked, but because something inside me had become very still, very precise. Because now, for the first time, I understood the full picture. This wasn't about a single betrayal. It wasn't about a Sharpie line on a document. It wasn't even about concealed ownership. It was about a long-term strategy, one built on 3 layers: concealment of truth, manipulation of legal structures, and financial extraction over time. Daniel closed the folder. "There's one more thing," he said. He pointed to a small notation at the bottom of the final page. "A scheduled event listed in the LLC's internal planning documents. Formal leadership transition announcement," it read. "Projected valuation adjustment immediately afterward." Daniel looked at me steadily. "If that event happens without intervention," he said, "it will significantly complicate any future legal challenge. Because once public leadership declarations are made, financial institutions, investors, and partners adjust their records accordingly. Perception becomes documentation, and documentation becomes reality." In other words, the ceremony wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic, the final step in securing permanent control. I closed the folder slowly, not angry, not emotional, just very clear, because now the situation had reached its final stage. All 3 layers of truth had been uncovered: the inheritance, the concealment, and the financial exploitation, which meant something else became clear. The silence I had maintained for weeks was about to end. But timing still mattered, because my grandmother's words echoed in my mind. Power comes from patience, and the perfect moment was already approaching. Just 12 days away, in a room full of witnesses, with microphones, with documentation, with an audience that would hear the truth all at once. I looked at Daniel Hale and said calmly, "Prepare a full report, Because when the leadership transition ceremony began, I would be ready. And what my father didn't understand yet was that silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means the truth is gathering strength. 12 days can feel very long when you're waiting for the exact moment to change someone's entire reality. But they can also feel very short when every one of those days is filled with preparation. I experienced both at the same time. From the outside, nothing about my life changed. I still arrived at the clinic at 7:00 a.m., still attended administrative meetings, still reviewed patient treatment plans. I even helped coordinate details for the leadership transition ceremony because my father assumed I would, and I let him believe that. There's a specific kind of power in being underestimated. People stop watching you. They stop guarding their words. They stop hiding information because they believe the outcome is already decided. My father believed exactly that. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I was building something he never anticipated. Not an argument, not an emotional confrontation, a record, a complete, documented, legally supported record of truth. The first step was securing the forensic accounting report. Daniel Hale delivered it 6 days before the ceremony. 42 pages, every transaction traced, every fiduciary violation explained in clear language. No speculation, no assumptions, just facts supported by financial evidence. I read the entire report twice, not because I doubted it, but because understanding it completely mattered. Because when truth is presented publicly, clarity determines credibility, and credibility determines impact. The second step was consulting an attorney of my own, not quietly, through family channels, not someone connected to my father, but an independent specialist in trust and fiduciary law. That's how I met Rebecca Lynn Caldwell, JD, 48 years old, sharp-minded, direct, the kind of lawyer who didn't waste words. When she read the documentation, she didn't react emotionally. She simply nodded once, then said, "This is strong." She explained everything calmly. The trust terms were clear. My father had violated his fiduciary duty by failing to notify the beneficiary, concealing transfer eligibility, redirecting profits for personal benefit, and attempting to restructure control without authorization. Legally, that meant something very important. I didn't just have a claim. I had standing, immediate standing, to assert control over the trust asset. But Rebecca emphasized something crucial. "If you act privately," she said, "he'll negotiate, deny, and delay." She paused. "But if you act publicly, with documentation, at a moment he cannot control." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to, because we both understood. Truth has the greatest power when it removes the ability to rewrite the narrative, which meant the leadership ceremony wasn't just an opportunity. It was the ideal setting. For the next week, Rebecca and Daniel worked together to prepare a legal disclosure packet. It contained certified copies of the original will, the supplemental directive letter, trust transfer eligibility documentation, forensic accounting findings, and formal notice of fiduciary breach. Every page was carefully organized, tab-labeled, legally authenticated, ready to withstand scrutiny. Because once presented, it couldn't be dismissed as rumor, or opinion, or family conflict. It would exist as documented fact. While they prepared the legal side, I focused on something equally important: understanding the human dynamics of the moment. Because public truth doesn't just affect the person being exposed, it affects everyone watching. Over the next several days, I paid close attention to the clinic staff. Their conversations, their assumptions, their expectations. Most of them believed the same narrative my father had promoted for years: that he built the clinic from nothing, that Ethan was the natural successor, that I was simply choosing a different professional path. None of them knew the truth, not because they were naive, but because they had never been given a reason to question the story. And that realization changed something inside me. Because this confrontation wouldn't just affect my father. It would change the understanding of everyone present. At 3:22 p.m. 4 days before the ceremony, my father stopped by my office. He leaned against the doorframe casually. "You've been very cooperative," he said. His tone carried something new. Approval, almost relief, as if he believed the situation had resolved itself peacefully. I met his gaze calmly. "I've always cared about the clinic," I said. That statement was true, just not in the way he assumed. He nodded. "That's why I know you'll land on your feet," he said. Then he added something that revealed his mindset completely. "You're strong, Natalie. You don't need ownership to succeed." That sentence stayed with me long after he left, because it revealed something essential. He genuinely believed what he had done was justified. Not malicious, not dishonest, just practical. Because in his mind, authority determined fairness. 2 days before the ceremony, Ethan stopped me in the hallway. He looked uncomfortable, nervous in a way I'd never seen before. "I hope you're not upset about everything," he said quietly. "I mean, it's just business." I studied his expression and realized something important. He didn't know the truth either. Not fully. He believed the same story he had always been told, that our father owned everything legitimately. That leadership transfer was his rightful inheritance. I nodded calmly. "It is business," I replied, and that was true, because by then the situation had moved beyond family emotion. It had become something precise, defined, documented, unavoidable. The night before the ceremony, I sat alone at my kitchen table. The disclosure packet rested in front of me. Thick, organized, quiet, like everything it contained. I thought about my grandmother's letter, her words about patience, about dignity, about insisting on truth rather than seeking revenge. And I realized something clearly. This moment wasn't about defeating my father. It wasn't about humiliating him. It was about restoring reality for everyone, including him. At 11:47 p.m., I closed the packet and placed it into a plain black folder. No dramatic labels, no visible markings, because the power wasn't in how it looked. It was in what it contained. I slept calmly that night, not because the situation was easy, but because for the first time since this began, everything was clear, prepared, ready. The next morning, the leadership transition ceremony would begin at 10:00 a.m. My father would stand in front of an audience, confident, certain, believing he was about to secure his legacy permanently. He had no idea that the foundation beneath that legacy was about to be revealed publicly for what it really was. And when that moment came, the truth wouldn't need to shout. It would only need to be read aloud. At 9:58 a.m., the conference hall was already full. Rows of white folding chairs faced a raised stage, decorated with blue banners that read, "Honoring Leadership, Celebrating the Future." Soft instrumental music played through ceiling speakers. Staff members stood in small clusters, chatting politely. Local business leaders checked their phones while sipping coffee from branded cups. From the outside, everything looked like a celebration. Professional, respectable, carefully organized. Exactly the kind of event my father loved, because public admiration had always been his favorite form of validation. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a simple navy dress. No statement jewelry, no visible folder, nothing that drew attention, just another staff member attending a company milestone. And that invisibility was intentional, because the most powerful moments don't begin with dramatic entrances. They begin quietly. I took a seat in the third row, slightly off-center, close enough to see the stage clearly, far enough to avoid immediate attention. From there, I watched the room carefully. Monica Ruiz sat near the back, reviewing her phone nervously. She knew something was coming. Not the exact details, but enough to sense the weight of it. Daniel Hale arrived quietly and took a seat along the side wall. His presence was unobtrusive, but his role would soon become critical. Rebecca Caldwell entered last, calm, composed, carrying a slim leather briefcase. She didn't sit near me. Instead, she positioned herself near the aisle, strategically placed to move forward easily when needed. At 10, 2 a.m., the room lights dimmed slightly, and my father stepped onto the stage. He wore a charcoal suit and a deep blue tie, the same tie he wore during major announcements. His posture was confident, his smile controlled, every movement deliberate. Applause filled the room. Warm, respectful, sincere, because to everyone present, he was a successful healthcare leader, a dedicated community figure, a man who built a respected clinic from the ground up. That was the narrative they believed. And until that moment, no one had reason to question it. He began speaking calmly. "Thank you all for being here today," he said. "Brooks' recovery and wellness has always been more than a business. It's been a family commitment to healing and service." His voice was steady, practiced, every word shaped to reinforce the story he had told for decades. He spoke about the early years, the challenges, the sacrifices, the growth of the clinic. And as he spoke, I noticed something important. He never once mentioned my grandmother's name, not even indirectly, because in his version of history, she had never been the foundation. Then he moved to the transition. After years of leadership, he said, "I'm proud to pass operational control to the next generation." He turned toward Ethan, who sat in the front row. "Please welcome our new managing partner, Ethan Brooks." The room applauded again, louder this time, because ceremonies rely on momentum, on emotional energy, on the assumption that everything happening is legitimate. Ethan walked onto the stage, smiling, nervous, excited, completely unaware of what was about to happen. He shook my father's hand, accepted a framed certificate, and stepped toward the podium. He began his speech confidently, talking about vision, innovation, expanding services, future growth, all the right words, all the expected promises, because he believed this moment was secure, final, permanent. As he spoke, I felt no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet clarity, because everything unfolding matched exactly what my grandmother had predicted. Control, narrative, public validation. At 10:19 a.m., Ethan finished speaking. The applause faded. My father stepped back to the microphone. He smiled warmly at the audience. "This is a proud moment for our family," he said, "and for the future of this clinic." That was the exact moment I stood up. At first, no one noticed. A single person standing in a room of seated attendees. It didn't draw immediate attention until I began walking toward the stage. The sound of my heels against the floor was quiet, but unmistakable. And gradually conversation stopped. Heads turned, eyes followed. My father saw me when I was halfway down the aisle. His expression shifted slightly. Confusion, then caution, but not concern yet, because he still believed he understood the situation. I stopped at the base of the stage, looked up calmly, and said in a clear, steady voice, "Before this transition continues, there's information that must be shared." The room became completely silent. Not tense yet, just surprised, because public ceremonies rarely include interruptions. My father tried to maintain control. "Natalie," he said carefully, "this isn't the appropriate time." I met his gaze without raising my voice. "It's exactly the appropriate time," I replied, "because this is a leadership transition." I paused, and leadership requires truth. That sentence shifted the atmosphere immediately, because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't accusatory. It was precise, calm, and impossible to dismiss casually. If you had been in that room, watching that moment unfold, what would you have expected next? An argument, a family dispute, an emotional confrontation, because what happened next was none of those things. Rebecca Caldwell stepped forward, quietly, professionally, holding the legal disclosure folder. She addressed the audience clearly. "My name is Rebecca Caldwell, legal counsel for Natalie Brooks." She paused just long enough for the words to settle. "And before any leadership transfer proceeds, there are legal matters regarding ownership that must be clarified." The room's energy changed instantly. Not chaotic, but alert, focused, because the language of law carries a unique weight. It signals seriousness, irreversibility, authority. My father's face tightened slightly, the first visible crack in his confidence. but he still attempted control. "This is a misunderstanding," he said firmly. "Private family matters," Rebecca interrupted gently. "This is not private," she said. "It concerns documented ownership of this organization." That was the moment everything shifted. Because once the word ownership entered the conversation, the narrative my father had built for decades began to fracture. Rebecca opened the folder, removed the first document, and said clearly, "We will begin with the original will of Margaret Evelyn Brooks." At the sound of my grandmother's name, the room fell into a deeper silence than before. Because no one had expected that. Not Ethan, not the staff, and most of all, not my father. His expression changed again. Not to anger, not yet, but to something far more revealing. Recognition, because he knew exactly what was coming next. The moment my grandmother's name was spoken out loud, the entire room seemed to shift. Not physically, but in awareness. Because for the first time since the ceremony began, people realized this wasn't a simple interruption. This was something serious, something structural, something that could change everything they thought they knew. Rebecca Caldwell stood calmly at the base of the stage, holding the certified copy of the will. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply began reading. "Margaret Evelyn Brooks, sole owner of Brooks Recovery and Wellness, hereby designates her granddaughter, Natalie Marie Brooks, as primary beneficiary of the clinic property and associated business interests." A ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the audience. Not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, because the words contradicted a belief most people in that room had held for years. That Daniel Brooks built the clinic, owned the clinic, controlled the clinic, Rebecca continued, to be held in trust under the management of Daniel Howard Brooks until the beneficiary reaches the age of 30. At that point, Ethan's head turned sharply toward my father. His expression wasn't angry yet, just confused, because this was the first time he had ever heard this information. My father stepped toward the microphone, his voice firm, controlled. "This document is being taken out of context," he said. "The trust structure is complicated. The clinic has always been under my operational authority." There it was, the first stage. Denial, not emotional, not explosive, just an attempt to frame the situation as a technical misunderstanding. A familiar strategy, one he had used many times in smaller conflicts. But this time, it wasn't just a conversation. It was a documented disclosure in front of witnesses. Rebecca nodded calmly. "Operational authority as trustee," she clarified. "Not ownership." She held up another page, and under the terms of the trust, full control was to transfer to Natalie Brooks upon her 30th birthday. The room became even quieter, because this wasn't an argument anymore. It was a timeline, a factual sequence, one that could be verified independently. Rebecca continued. "That transfer eligibility date occurred 2 years ago." She paused. "And documentation confirms the beneficiary was never notified." This time, the reaction was visible. Several staff members exchanged glances. A donor representative shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the local health board official, sitting near the front, leaned forward slightly. Because failure to notify a trust beneficiary wasn't a minor procedural issue. It was serious, potentially actionable. My father's jaw tightened. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "This is a family matter," he said firmly, "and it will be resolved privately." That was the second stage beginning. Blame shifting, reframing the situation as something inappropriate to discuss publicly. Because if it became private again, he could regain control of the narrative. Rebecca responded without hesitation. This became a public matter the moment a leadership transition was announced for an asset whose ownership status is legally contested. Her tone remained steady, professional, impossible to dismiss as emotional. Ethan finally spoke, his voice uncertain. "Dad, is this true?" That question carried more weight than anything said so far, because it came from the person my father believed he was protecting, the heir he had been preparing, the son whose future depended on the narrative remaining intact. For a brief moment, my father hesitated, and that hesitation revealed more than any denial could. Because people hesitate when they know the truth cannot be fully denied. He turned toward Ethan. "Of course not," he said, his voice sharper now. "This is being exaggerated." But the certainty that once filled his tone was gone, and everyone in the room could hear it. Rebecca opened the next section of the folder. This documentation also includes financial records prepared by a certified forensic accountant. She held up the report, demonstrating that during the period after the beneficiary became eligible for control, approximately $1.8 million in clinic revenue was redirected into a separate holding entity controlled by the trustee. That statement changed the atmosphere completely, because now the issue wasn't just ownership, it was money. Large amounts of money in financial matters are something everyone understands instinctively. A low murmur spread across the room. Not outrage, but shock, because the scale of the number made the situation impossible to interpret as a simple misunderstanding. My father's face flushed slightly. "This is routine administrative structuring," he said quickly. "Standard business practice." There it was. The third defensive strategy, minimization, framing serious actions as ordinary procedures. But Rebecca was prepared. "The transfers themselves may be structured legally," she said calmly. "However, under fiduciary law, trustees are obligated to act solely in the beneficiary's best interest." She paused, and redirecting revenue to reduce the value of a trust asset prior to transfer eligibility constitutes a breach of that duty. The words landed heavily because they weren't accusations. They were legal definitions, and legal definitions carry authority. At that moment, my father's composure began to crack visibly. Not dramatically, but in small telling ways. His shoulders tightened. His breathing became slightly uneven. His eyes moved rapidly between Rebecca, me, and the audience. The realization was dawning. He was losing control of the narrative, and control had always been his greatest source of power. Ethan stepped away from him slightly, a subtle movement, but one that everyone could see. Because trust doesn't disappear loudly. It shifts quietly. My father turned back to the microphone, his voice no longer calm. "This is an attack," he said. "A personal vendetta disguised as legal procedure." There it was, the fourth stage beginning. Victim positioning, attempting to reframe himself as the target rather than the actor. A familiar pattern, one he had used many times in smaller conflicts. But now, the scale was too large, the documentation too clear, the audience too aware. Rebecca closed the folder gently. "All documentation presented today will be formally submitted through appropriate legal channels," she said. "This disclosure is simply to ensure that no public leadership transfer occurs under false ownership assumptions." The room fell into complete silence because the meaning was clear. The ceremony could not continue as planned, not without addressing the truth. For the first time since this began, my father had no immediate response, no narrative to offer, no authority to assert. Because authority built on assumption collapses quickly when confronted with evidence. And in that silence, something else became visible. Not anger, not humiliation, but something deeper. The realization that the story he had told for decades was no longer his to control. Silence can sound different, depending on what it follows. There's the quiet after a celebration, the quiet after bad news, and then there's the silence that falls when a long-held belief collapses all at once. That was the kind of silence filling the conference hall at 10:37 a.m. No one was speaking. No one was moving, because everyone present was recalculating what they thought they knew. My father still stood at the microphone, but something fundamental had changed. He wasn't in control of the room anymore, and he knew it. You could see it in the smallest details. The way his fingers tightened around the podium edge, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his eyes scanned the audience, not with authority, but with urgency. looking for someone who still believed him. He tried to recover. "This is a misunderstanding," he said again, louder now. "I've devoted my life to this clinic. Everything I did was to protect it." There it was, the transition from denial to justification. A subtle but critical shift. Because when someone stops denying facts, they begin explaining their motives. And explanations, unlike denials, acknowledge reality. He turned toward the audience. "You all know what I've sacrificed," he continued. "You know what I built." But this time, the words didn't land the way they always had. Because belief is fragile. It survives only as long as evidence doesn't contradict it. And now, the evidence was visible, documented, undeniable. Ethan stepped forward slowly, his face pale, his voice unsteady. "Dad," he said quietly, "did you know about the will?" The question cut deeper than any legal statement. Because it wasn't coming from an opponent. It was coming from the person my father believed was his greatest ally, his son, his chosen successor. For a moment, my father said nothing, and that hesitation told everyone in the room exactly what the answer was. He finally spoke. "I handled everything legally," he said. "I did what was necessary to keep the clinic stable." That was the moment the final stage began. The shift from justification to self-victimization. Because necessary is the word people use when they believe their actions were unavoidable. When they believe circumstances forced their hand. Ethan took a step back. Not dramatically, just slightly. But the distance between them suddenly felt enormous. Because trust doesn't break loudly. It breaks quietly. In moments like that, Rebecca Caldwell stepped forward once more. Not aggressively, just with calm finality. "There is no dispute regarding your years of operational leadership," she said. "But fiduciary law does not measure intent." She paused. "It measures actions." Those words landed with quiet precision. Because they removed emotion from the equation entirely. This wasn't about whether he loved the clinic or believed he was protecting it. It was about whether he had followed the legal responsibilities he accepted. And the documentation made that answer clear. Several members of the clinic's senior staff began whispering to each other. Not loudly, but enough to signal something important. The narrative had shifted. Because authority depends on perception, and perception changes quickly when truth becomes visible. My father turned toward me for the first time since the reading began. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't pleading. It was something far more complex. Recognition. Because in that moment, he understood something he had never expected. I wasn't confronting him emotionally. I wasn't seeking an argument. I wasn't even speaking. I was simply allowing the truth to stand on its own. And that made it impossible to challenge. He looked at me steadily. "You could have handled this privately," he said. His voice carried a quiet accusation, as if public exposure itself was the betrayal, not the actions that led to it. I met his gaze calmly and said the only thing that needed to be said. I tried to understand it privately. I paused, but the truth was never given privately. The room remained completely still, because the simplicity of that statement made it impossible to argue against. If you had been sitting there, watching a lifetime of authority unravel in front of you, what would you have expected to feel? Vindication, relief, anger. Because what I felt was none of those things. I felt clarity. Because this moment wasn't about winning. It wasn't about defeating someone. It was about restoring balance. After years of imbalance, the clinic's board liaison finally stood, his voice formal, careful. Given the documentation presented, he said, any leadership transition must be postponed pending legal review. There it was, the irreversible turning point. Not dramatic, not emotional, just procedural. Because in institutions, the most powerful consequences come quietly, through official processes, not loud confrontations. The applause banners behind the stage suddenly looked out of place. Because the event they were meant to celebrate no longer existed. My father stepped away from the microphone slowly, not defeated in appearance, but diminished. Because authority built on assumption cannot survive direct verification. Ethan didn't follow him. He remained standing where he was, silent, processing, because his understanding of his own future had just shifted completely. Rebecca closed her briefcase. Daniel Hale gathered his reports. The audience remained seated, not because they were instructed to stay, but because they needed time to absorb what had just happened. And in that stillness, I realized something my grandmother had understood long ago. Truth doesn't need force to change a system. It only needs exposure. As I turned to leave the stage area, my father spoke one last time, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "You've taken everything from me," he said. I stopped, not to argue, not to respond emotionally, just to answer calmly. I didn't take anything I said. I just stopped protecting a story that wasn't true. That was the moment the room fully understood. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. And once correction begins, it cannot be undone. 3 months later, the clinic lobby looked exactly the same. Same citrus clean scent. Same instrumental music drifting from ceiling speakers. Same rows of chairs where families waited beside loved ones in recovery. From the outside, nothing had changed, but everything had. Because sometimes, the most profound transformations are invisible to anyone who doesn't know the full story. The legal process moved steadily after the ceremony. Not dramatically, not loudly, just methodically. Because institutions don't react emotionally. They respond to documentation, and the documentation was clear. Within 6 weeks, the trust transfer was finalized. Operational control of Brooke's recovery and wellness was formally reassigned to me. Not as a sudden victory, not as a dramatic reversal, just as a correction of what should have happened 2 years earlier. The forensic accounting findings were reviewed through proper legal channels, and the resolution was equally quiet. My father was required to repay the redirected funds through a structured settlement agreement. No criminal charges, no public trial, just financial accountability, because fiduciary breaches are often resolved through restitution rather than punishment. He left the clinic 2 weeks after the ceremony. Not forced, not escorted. He simply stopped coming. And the day he returned his office keys, he didn't say anything. He placed them on the reception desk, nodded once, and walked out. Ethan didn't leave with him. At first, he barely spoke to me, not out of anger, but because his entire understanding of our family history had been shaken. It takes time to rebuild trust when the foundation has been unstable for so long. 2 months later, he came to my office, sat quietly across from me, and said something simple. I didn't know. I believed him, because manipulation rarely targets only one person. It affects everyone inside the system. Some just realize it sooner than others. He didn't ask for ownership. He didn't argue. He simply asked for a position, not as a partner, as an employee. And I gave it to him, because correction isn't about exclusion. It's about restoring fairness. If you had been in my position, after everything that happened, would you have cut him out completely or given him a chance to rebuild something? Honestly, because that choice mattered more than anything else in the end. The clinic itself continued operating without disruption. Patients still received treatment. Staff still followed their routines. And gradually, the narrative adjusted. Not through announcements, not through explanations, just through time. Because people adapt to truth more easily than they adapt to conflict. Monica Ruiz remained in her position. Her support during the transition proved invaluable. And one afternoon, about a month after everything settled, she said something quietly while we reviewed billing reports. I always thought you'd end up leading this place, she said. She paused. I just didn't realize how much you'd have to go through to get there. Neither had I. But some journeys are only visible in hindsight. As for my father, I saw him once after everything was finalized. At a grocery store on the far side of town. He looked older, not physically weaker, just smaller somehow. As if authority had been a kind of armor he no longer wore. He didn't approach me. He didn't speak. He simply nodded. And I nodded back, because some relationships don't end with closure. They end with quiet acceptance. I didn't feel anger in that moment, or triumph, or even sadness. I felt something much simpler: distance. Because distance is sometimes the most peaceful form of resolution. One evening, about 6 months after the ceremony, I visited the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. It was late October. The maple trees around the grounds were turning deep shades of orange and gold. I brought a small bouquet of white lilies, her favorite. I sat beside the stone for a long time, not speaking, just remembering, because everything that had happened traced back to one quiet decision she made decades earlier: to protect the truth and trust that one day I would be strong enough to face it. I placed the flowers gently and whispered something I had never said before. Thank you for believing in me before I knew how to believe in myself. The wind moved softly through the leaves, and for a moment I felt something settle inside me completely. Not relief, not closure, something deeper. Alignment. Because revenge had never been the goal. Correction had been. And correction doesn't shout. It restores balance quietly. Back at the clinic, my office window overlooks the parking lot where patients arrive each morning. I watch them sometimes as they step out of their cars, nervous, hopeful, uncertain, because recovery always begins with truth. The truth about where you are and what needs to change. On my desk, I keep two things side by side: the original trust document and my grandmother's handwritten letter. The line I return to most often is still the simplest one. You are not taking anything away from him. You are only reclaiming what was always yours. And that sentence has become something more than a memory. It's become a principle for leadership, for boundaries, for justice. Because here's what I learned through all of this: silence is not loyalty when it protects harm. Authority is not ownership. And truth, when revealed calmly, is more powerful than any confrontation. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever had to choose between protecting peace and protecting truth, remember this: you don't need to shout to change your life. Sometimes all you need to do is stop pretending something untrue is acceptable. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. If it meant something to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Because there are more stories like this. Stories about family betrayal, inheritance, and the quiet ways the tables turn when truth finally comes into the light. And one of them might sound more familiar than you expect.